Okay, so what do you actually do? This is my parents trying to figure out what I do for a living. I tell them they know that I research cancer, but the question that always comes up is how? What's a normal day like then? And the best I can come up with is cells. I work with cells. I do things to cells, and then I see what happens to cells, and more specifically cancer cells, and in particular I try and stop them being cancer cells. So what are these cells? Where did they come from? Why are they important in medical research? So today I'm going to tell you the story of where these cells came from, and it starts with an African-American woman from South Virginia. She died in 1951 and yet still obtains the unusual ability of being immortal. This woman changed the world of medical research, which over 60 years ago was going at an incredibly slow pace. Scientists were spending more time trying to get cells to grow outside of the body than they were actually experimenting on the cells. And round about the same time, a terribly unjust breach of trust resulted in the discovery of some immortal cells. Henrietta Lacks was a tobacco farmer. She had a husband and 2 children, and at the age of 30, she was admitted to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, with a complaint of abdominal pain and internal bleeding. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer. During radiotherapy treatments, doctors took 2 cervical samples from Henrietta without her knowledge or consent. And sadly, 10 months later, Henrietta died. However, the cells that were wrongfully taken from her did not die. They continued to grow in a lab that belonged to Dr. George Guy. Before this, cells taken from patients could only survive it a few days at the most, but Henrietta's cells continued to grow and grow throughout generations. Finally, we had a tool for researching cancer. And immediately, Dr. George Guy appeared on American television claiming he'd found a way of conquering cancer once and for all. Of course, he made no mention of Henrietta, even though he was holding a flask of her cells during the interview. Her cells later became known as the HeLa cell line, taking the first 2 letters from her first and last name. You'd think this would immediately identify her as the source of the cells, but fake names such as Helen Larson or Helen Lane were used to throw the media off track. Her cells were put straight to use in the fight against polio, which in the 1950s was killing or paralysing over 500,000 people every year. It turned out that HeLa cells responded to the polio virus just as they would inside a human, and so they were heavily sought after by scientists who wanted to develop a vaccine. HeLa cells went into mass production, and only a year later a drug was sent for clinical trials. They're also the first cells to be cloned in 1955, and that led to the development of IVF treatment. Henrietta's cells were sent into space by NASA to test the effects of gravity on human cells before sending proper astronauts. One scientist had an accident. He spilt some chemicals on HeLa cells, and this resulted in the chromosomes to separate out so he could clearly count them. And he discovered that we actually have 46 chromosomes, not 48 that was previously thought. And this mistake led to the diagnosis of many genetic diseases, for example, Down syndrome, which is caused by an abnormal amount of chromosomes. So why were these cells immortal? What was so special about Henrietta Lacks that made her the immortal woman? Well, it turns out that the cells taken from Henrietta's cervix contained an unusually high amount of telomerase. We now know that the shortening of telomeres, which are the ends of chromosomes, is what causes aging and cell death. This is what restricts a cell to dividing just a few times before it dies. Telomerase stops this shortening and allows a cell to grow on and on and on and eventually form a tumour. And this explains why Henrietta's cells were able to grow in Dr. George Guy's lab and why we now have an immortal cell line. Over 600,000 articles have been published on research using HeLa cells, and that number is meant to be increasing every month by 300. Meanwhile, in South Virginia, the Lacks family had no idea this had happened until 25 years after Henrietta's death. It turned out that HeLa cells could float on dust particles or travel on someone's unwashed hands, and in the lab they were contaminating other cell experiments. So a group of scientists decided to track down Henrietta's relatives, test their DNA, and then they could separate the HeLa cells from the non-HeLa cells and decontaminate all their samples. So one day, Henrietta's husband David got a phone call from a scientist. David Lacks wasn't lucky enough to have a great education. He didn't know what a cell was, and that conversation he had with the scientist turned out to be a big misunderstanding. What David heard was, we have your wife, she's in our lab, she's alive, we're researching on her, and we want to test your children for cancer. Of course, this wasn't what the scientists said, but from that moment on, the secret was out. HeLa cells were about to change the lives of the Lacks family. Deborah Lacks was Henrietta's daughter, but she didn't know her mother as she was just an infant when she died. But when she heard that part of her mother was still alive, she was desperate to know more. She had so many questions like, does it hurt her mother when they inject her cells with viruses and toxins? Had they actually cloned her? What could they tell her about Henrietta? What was her favourite colour? Did she like to dance? Her brothers, on the other hand, weren't too concerned with the cells until they found out about the amount of money involved. HeLa cells were the first biological material to be bought and sold all over the globe, and this created a multi-billion-dollar industry. The Lacks family had lived in poverty all their lives, and one of Henrietta's sons was living on the streets of Baltimore when he found out that vials of her cells were being sold for millions of dollars. He was understandably very angry. The Lacks story was made famous in 2010 when a journalist, Rebecca Skloot, published The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, an award-winning book that describes how the family went, in their own words, from being victims to a victory of proud family heritage. And they now focus on the positive aspects of Henrietta's contribution to the world. In 2013, the National Institute of Health announced that although they couldn't compensate the family financially, they were making changes within the scientific community in order to pay respect to the family. Previously, any genetic information on the Lacks family was available to anyone that wanted it, but now it's only granted with strict permission. 2 family members actually sit on a medical research council and decide what research is given funding using HeLa cells. Any scientist that publishes data with HeLa cells is now asked to acknowledge the family in their publication. But for me, the most important part of the HeLa story is the development of cell culture, the ability to grow cells in a lab and study disease without human or mouse models. Immortalized cell lines now exist in their millions, and they come from consenting patients who are protected by the Human Tissue Act. I use cells very much like those that originated from Henrietta Lacks. Drugs can be developed to block signals that promote cancer, but what happens when those signals are needed for other processes, such as maintaining blood pressure or kidney function? I test the effect of blocking these signals by using immortalized cancer cell lines before we can make a drug and send it to clinical trials. Cancer is a horrible disease, but over the last 40 years, chances of surviving it have doubled, and this is because we have proper research tools like immortalized cell lines. What happened to Henrietta and her family was wrong, but we're now treating patients with the respect that they deserve. My parents might not understand everything I do, but they know that the cells I work with are important, and I hope now you do too.